The maps of Europe changed 4 times between 1914 and 1950, and every time they changed, people who had lived in the same towns for generations woke up in a different country without moving an inch. In the final reshaping, which began in 1944 and concluded roughly by 1950, approximately 12 million ethnic Germans were expelled from territories where they or their ancestors had lived for centuries. They left behind villages, cemeteries, churches, land deeds, and in many cases, everything they had ever owned. The populations of entire regions effectively ceased to exist in the places where they had always been. What genetic research, conducted decades later using the accumulated DNA of millions of people in commercial genealogy databases, has now revealed is that the communities did not disappear. They spattered, and a portion of them reassembled, quietly, in the American interior. To understand what the genetics are actually measuring, it helps to know who these people were before 1945. Ethnic Germans had been migrating eastward and settling outside the German-speaking heartland for roughly 800 years, beginning with medieval colonization movements that took German farmers, craftsmen, and urban settlers into Poland, Bohemia, the Baltic coast, Transylvania, and eventually into Russian territory along the Volga River and in the Black Sea steppe. By the early 20th century, the result of these migrations was a patchwork of compact German-speaking communities scattered across Central and Eastern Europe, each with its own dialect, its own regional customs, and its own unique identity that was distinct from the Germany of the Reich and from the surrounding non-German population. The Sudeten Germans of Bohemia and Moravia, which is now the Czech Republic, numbered approximately 3 million in 1938. The Danube Swabs, who had settled along the Danube River in what is now Hungary, Serbia, and Romania, were roughly 500,000. The Transylvanian Saxons in Romania had maintained continuous communities since the 12th century. The Baltic Germans of Latvia and Estonia had been a ruling class since the Teutonic Knights arrived in the 13th century. The Volga Germans had been invited to settle in Russia by Catherine the Great in 1763 and had maintained German language communities on the Volga steppe for 180 years before the first of them began leaving for America. Each of these communities had a genetic profile that was shaped by centuries of relatively limited intermarriage outside their own group, by the specific origins of the founding population, and by the geographic isolation that came from being a linguistic minority surrounded by different cultures. Sudeten Germans drew their ancestry primarily from southwestern Germany, Bavaria, and Franconia, the regions that had supplied the medieval colonists who settled in the Bohemian uplands. Danube Swabs derived largely from the Rhineland, Swabia, and Alsace, recruited in the 18th century to repopulate land in Hungary devastated by Ottoman wars. Transylvanian Saxons showed a genetic signature consistent with medieval Flemish and Luxembourgish origins, distinct from the surrounding Romanian and Hungarian populations, and distinct from Germans in Germany proper. Volga Germans showed the greatest internal diversity because Catherine's recruitment had drawn from Hesse, the Palatinate, Württemberg, and the Rhineland, but the long period of endogamy on the steppe had nevertheless produced detectable patterns. These were not the genetic signatures of Germany as a nation. They were the signatures of specific regional waves of migration that happened to be German-speaking, frozen in genetic amber by centuries of community endogamy. What happened to these communities between 1944 and 1950 was the largest forced population transfer in recorded European history. The Potsdam Agreement of August 1945, signed by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, authorized the transfer of German populations from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary to the occupied zones of Germany in a manner that was to be orderly and humane. What followed was frequently neither. In Czechoslovakia, the Beneš decrees issued in 1945 stripped Sudeten Germans of their citizenship, confiscated their property, and authorized their expulsion. Between 1945 and 1946, approximately 2.5 million Sudeten Germans were forced out of Bohemia and Moravia into the American and Soviet occupation zones of Germany. In Poland, the German populations of Silesia, Pomerania and East Prussia were expelled as the new Polish western border was drawn along the Oder and Neisse rivers, incorporating territory that had been demographically German for centuries. In Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Romania, the Danube Swabians were expelled, interned, or subjected to forced labor in Soviet camps. The populations of hundreds of villages that had been German for 300 years were physically removed within a period of months. The buildings remained. The names on the gravestones remained. The people were gone. The expellees who entered the occupation zones of Germany arrived largely destitute, having been permitted to carry only what they could physically transport, sometimes only what fit in a single suitcase. In the immediate post-war years, West Germany absorbed approximately 8 million of these expellees, a demographic event that strained every social and economic system in the country. The German word for these people was Vertriebene, the expelled, and it entered the legal vocabulary of the new Federal Republic when the Expellee Law of 1953 established their status as a recognized group with specific rights. Many of them never fully integrated into West German society in the first generation, remaining in communities of shared regional identity, maintaining the dialects of the lands they had left, and transmitting to their children a precise and geographically specific sense of where they had come from, even as the villages they described ceased to be German places. But not all of them went to Germany. The United States Displaced Persons Act of 1948, extended in 1950, admitted approximately 400,000 displaced persons from Europe, of whom a significant number were ethnic German expellees from Eastern Europe. The act was designed primarily for Jews, Poles, and Balts displaced by the war, but its provisions included categories that covered expellees who could demonstrate anti-communist persecution or who fit the definition of displaced person under the eligibility criteria of the International Refugee Organization. The exact numbers of ethnic German expellees admitted under the Displaced Persons Act versus under regular immigration quotas are difficult to establish with precision because German nationality and ethnic German identity were not always recorded identically in the immigration documents. What is documented is that Sudeten Germans, Danube Swabians, Volga Germans who had ended up in post-war camps, and Baltic Germans all appear in the immigration records of the late 1940s and early 1950s in numbers that are meaningful at the community level. The Volga Germans are a particularly well-documented case because their emigration to the United States had a much longer history than that of most other expellee groups. Beginning in the 1870s, when the Russian government revoked the exemptions from military service that Catherine the Great had promised them, Volga Germans began emigrating to the Great Plains of North America. Between 1876 and 1914, approximately 100,000 Volga Germans settled in Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, South Dakota, and North Dakota, founding communities in Lincoln, Kansas, Hastings, Nebraska, and Sutton, Nebraska that were German in language, Lutheran or Catholic in religion, and Volga River in their specific cultural memory rather than German in any national sense. They had not come from Germany. They had come from Russia, via Germany, via the Volga steppe, and their regional identity was hyper-specific to the colonies Catherine had founded in 1763 and 1764, colonies with names like Norka, Frank, Walter, Schontau, and Kolb that no longer exist as German places. When the Soviet government in the 1930s deported the remaining Volga Germans to Siberia and Kazakhstan during the Second World War, the communities in America became the only surviving populations of several of these specific colonial groups. This is the context in which genetic research conducted in the 21st century has produced findings that are both scientifically interesting and personally significant to tens of thousands of living people. The large commercial DNA databases, which now contain the genetic profiles of over 40 million individuals between the major platforms, have been used by population geneticists to identify clustering patterns that correspond to historical communities rather than to modern national borders. A study published in the journal Current Biology in 2019 demonstrated that customers of a major DNA testing platform could be sorted into genetic clusters that corresponded with remarkable precision to the regions of origin their grandparents or great-grandparents had identified in records, even when those regions had not been called by those names since before the Second World War. The genetic signature of Volga German ancestry, when isolated in the database, is distinguishable from both general German ancestry and from Russian ancestry, reflecting the long period of community endogamy that the Volga colonies maintained and the specific regional German origin of the founding population in the 18th century. The signature of Sudeten-German ancestry can be distinguished from both general Czech and general German signals, sitting in a position that reflects both the Bohemian geographic location and the southwestern German origin of the colonial population. What makes these findings significant beyond their academic interest is the implication for the descendants of these communities who are living in the United States and using consumer DNA tests without necessarily knowing the specificity of what their results are reflecting. A person whose great-grandparents emigrated from the Volga colonies in the 1890s and settled in Kansas may have a family oral history that describes them as German or Russian, or sometimes simply as coming from the Old Country without further specification. When that person receives a DNA result that shows a clustering signature consistent with Volga German ancestry rather than with the general German population, the result is not merely telling them they have German ancestry. It is telling them something about a specific 18th century migration, a specific set of colonies, a specific community that survived intact as a genetic unit for nearly 2 centuries before dispersing again. For the descendants of the post-war expellees, the finding is similarly precise. A person whose grandparents arrived as Sudeten-German refugees in 1950 and settled in Ohio or Pennsylvania may carry a genetic signature that clusters not with the general German population of Bavaria or Prussia, but specifically with the Bohemian German community that was expelled en masse in 1946. The academic research that has made these distinctions possible draws on a methodology called identity by descent analysis, which identifies segments of DNA shared between individuals that are long enough to indicate shared ancestry within a genealogically meaningful timeframe. When a large number of people with documented Volga German ancestry share DNA segments with each other at rates that exceed what would be expected from general German background population sharing, the algorithm identifies this as a distinct cluster. When that cluster is then mapped against a database at large, every individual whose DNA falls into that cluster becomes a candidate for Volga German ancestry, whether or not their paper records have preserved that specific information. Researchers at Stanford, at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and at several university genetics departments in Germany have published work using commercial database access and specifically recruited participant populations to characterize the genetic profiles of German expellee communities. The Sudeten-German Homeland Association, which has maintained organizational continuity since the 1940s and preserves extensive genealogical records of the expelled population, has cooperated with some of these research programs to provide population-specific genetic reference panels. The living descendants of these communities in the United States are more numerous than most people outside those communities would expect. Estimates of the total number of Americans with Volga German ancestry range from approximately 300,000 to over 1 million, depending on how many generations of descent are counted and how the population is bounded. Estimates of Americans with Sudeten-German ancestry, including both pre-war immigrants and post-war refugees, are in the range of 1 to 2 million. Danube-Swabian Americans concentrated in communities in Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, New Jersey, and New York number in the hundreds of thousands. Transylvanian Saxon Americans are a smaller group but have maintained organizational structures including the Alliance of Transylvanian Saxons, founded in 1902 in Cleveland, Ohio, that have preserved genealogical records across more than a century. These communities have not been invisible. They have maintained churches, newspapers, annual festivals, and genealogical societies for decades. What has changed is that genetic research now connects people outside these communities, people who have no family oral tradition pointing to this specific ancestry, to the same historical communities through their DNA. The practical experience of encountering this genetic information is described in detail by genealogists who work with the expellee communities and their descendants. A person with a family name like Schreiber or Weiss or Weber, who has always understood their ancestry as generically German and who submits a DNA sample to a commercial platform, may receive an ethnicity estimate that includes a regional assignment they do not immediately recognize. Platforms that use community-based clustering rather than continental ethnicity estimates may label this as Volga German or Danube region German or Eastern Europe German, depending on their reference panels. The person who then traces backward through their genealogical records and discovers great-grandparents who emigrated from Kansas colonies in the 1870s and traces those Kansas colonies back to the Volga River settlements of the 1760s is reconstructing a migration chain that connects an 18th century Russian steppe to a 21st century American suburb through 7 or 8 generations of people who kept their community identity intact long enough for it to leave a genetic mark. For the post-war expellees and their children, the genetic discovery sometimes fills in records that were deliberately or accidentally incomplete. Families that fled with minimal documentation, that adopted simplified spellings of German place names to avoid the stigma attached to German identity in post-war America, or that simply never discussed their origins because the memory was too painful, may have left their American-born children or grandchildren with no usable genealogical information about where specifically the family had come from. A genetic clustering result that points to Sudeten German ancestry is not a complete family history. It is a geographic coordinate. It narrows the research from the entire German-speaking world to a specific arc of mountain borderland between Germany and Bohemia, to specific villages whose German populations are documented in the Heimatbücher, the homeland books that Sudeten German organizations produced as memorial records of the expelled communities. Those Heimatbücher, maintained in archives in Bavaria and available through the Sudetenland Documentation Center in Munich, list the family names, the addresses, and in many cases, the fates of the German inhabitants of specific Bohemian and Moravian towns as of 1945. A person who can match their genetic cluster to Sudeten German ancestry and then match their family surname to a Heimatbuch entry is making a connection across a deliberate erasure. The communities that geneticists have been able to characterize most precisely are the ones that maintain the longest periods of endogamy and the most geographically bounded settlement patterns. The Volga German colonies are the clearest case because they combine several factors that maximize genetic distinctiveness. The founding population was already regionally specific rather than broadly German. Geographic isolation on the Russian steppe limited intermarriage for over a century. Religious structures reinforced in-group marriage, and then a migration to the American Great Plains initially reproduced the same pattern of concentrated community settlement. The result is that Volga German ancestry is identifiable in a DNA sample with a precision that ancestry from, say, a 19th century German immigrant from Hamburg who settled in a diverse urban environment is not. The Hamburg immigrant's descendants show up as German, but not specifically locatable. The Volga German's descendants show up as a distinct cluster that can be traced back to a specific slice of the historical population. The history that produced this genetic pattern was not abstract. In 1941, the Soviet government issued a decree ordering the deportation of all Volga Germans from their colonies on the grounds that the community posed a security risk following the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Within weeks, approximately 400,000 people were transported east to Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan in conditions that killed thousands, particularly children and the elderly. The Volga German colonies were disbanded, renamed, and resettled with other Soviet citizens. The communities that had existed since 1763, that had sent 100,000 immigrants to the American Great Plains, that had maintained German language and culture through a century and a half of Russian sovereignty, ceased to exist on the Volga River in September 1941. The American communities were, from that point forward, the only places on Earth where those specific communities continued in an unbroken social line. The genetic research that identifies Volga German clusters in American DNA databases is, in a precise sense, documenting the continuation of communities that were deliberately destroyed in Russia. For the expelled Sudetengermans, the parallel is direct and the time frame is different. The towns they left in 1945 and 1946 were renamed in Czech, their German language signs were removed, their churches were converted or demolished, and their cemeteries were, in many cases, left untended until the monuments deteriorated beyond readability. The German place names that Sudeten expellees taught their children, Brooks, Egger, Aussig, Carlsbad, Reichenberg, were replaced by Czech names Most, Cheb, Ústí nad Labem, Karlovy Vary, Liberec, and the transformation was systematic enough that within 2 generations, the German version of those names was understood only by the displaced community itself and by historians. The genetic data does not restore the towns. It does not undo the expulsions. What it does is confirm that the communities that existed in those places produced a genetically traceable population, and that population dispersed into Germany, Austria, Australia, Argentina, Canada, and the United States, where its descendants can now be found in genealogical databases that did not exist when the expulsions happened. There is a methodological caution that serious researchers emphasize when discussing these genetic findings, and it is worth stating clearly. A genetic cluster labeled Volga German or Sudetengerman in a commercial DNA database is a statistical inference, not a definitive genealogical proof. It means that the person's DNA is more similar to the reference population for that cluster than to other reference populations, which is consistent with ancestry from that community, but does not rule out other explanations. The accuracy of the assignment increases as the reference panel for the specific community grows, which is why the Volga German community, which has been studied in multiple dedicated genetic research projects and whose American descendants are numerous enough to provide large reference samples, has a more precise cluster characterization than smaller or less studied expellee groups. For genealogical purposes, a genetic cluster assignment is best understood as a hypothesis that directs documentary research rather than a conclusion that replaces it. The combination of a Volga German genetic cluster assignment with documentary records showing a family emigrating from Kansas Volga German colonies in the early 20th century is stronger evidence than either element alone. The documentary resources that exist for researching ex-belly ancestry in America are more extensive than most people realize. The Balch Institute at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania holds records of German-American organizations, including ex-belly associations. The Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota maintains records of ethnic German organizations and publications, including those of the Danube-Swabian community. The American Historical Society of Germans from Russia, based in Lincoln, Nebraska, maintains genealogical records and a comprehensive library specifically focused on Volga German and Black Sea German emigration to the United States. The Germans from Russia Heritage Society in Bismarck, North Dakota, serves a similar function for the northern Great Plains communities. These organizations have been indexing, scanning, and sharing records for decades, and the combination of their genealogical archives with commercial DNA testing has accelerated the rate at which individuals are able to make specific connections between their American family trees and the communities that were displaced or destroyed after 1945. What remains after all the genetic analysis and the archival work and the genealogical reconstruction is a simple historical fact stated in demographic terms. Millions of people were removed from the places where they had lived, and the places were then inhabited by others who erased most of the visible evidence that the previous inhabitants had been there. The genetic record, which cannot be erased in the same way that a gravestone can be removed or a place name can be changed, preserves evidence of those communities in the bodies of their descendants. A person in Ohio or Nebraska or New Jersey who submits a saliva sample to a commercial DNA platform and receives a cluster assignment that points toward a Bohemian borderland or a Volga River steppe is receiving information about a history that was, in many cases, deliberately made inaccessible. The research that generated that information was not designed as a memorial project. It was designed as a scientific exercise in population genetics. But the people who receive its results and then find their way to the Heimatbücher, or the Volga German colony records, or the Danube Swabian church registers, are doing something that has a character beyond genealogical research. They are finding, in data that was never meant to carry this weight, evidence that the communities their ancestors came from were real, were specific, and left behind more than rubble and renamed streets.